Perhaps a man's character was like a tree, and his reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. Abraham Lincoln.
There's something about him that makes you want to be the best person you can be.
People knew that they were in the presence of brilliance.
I can't explain it. It was a manner, a style to command that kind of respect.
His talents were patience and listening, and then being decisive.
When he spoke, everyone listened.
The lasting legacy is that when you wake up in the morning and you turn on the tap, you don't have to think about where the water comes from.
In Riverside, California, family and friends gathered from around the country and across the world to celebrate with a man whose grace, elegance, and statesmanlike demeanor has inspired generations of men and women who have known him. So accomplished and nationally recognized as a water law attorney is he, that the United States Supreme Court named him a special master. He led Riverside's successful effort to integrate its entire public school system at the height of America's civil rights strife in 1965, a story of national significance. He led the foundation that spearheaded the drive to save Riverside's iconic yet troubled Mission Inn in the 1970s and 80s. Today, the inn serves as the cultural and financial catalyst that has defined Riverside's downtown economic renaissance. He has litigated some of the most difficult and contentious water law cases in the history of California, and his advice has been sought by some of the most prominent individuals in the United States. Proclaimed Riverside's Citizen of the Century, he is universally considered one of her all-time greatest residents. A loving and engaged family man who also places the highest value on his faith and innumerable friendships. His name is Arthur L. Littleworth, and he has lived the quintessential American life, a good life. He was born Arthur Leroy Littleworth on May 2, 1923 in Northern California, the firstborn child to parents Roy and Rose Littleworth, and named, quite possibly, after an uncle who died as a boy, although nothing was spoken of it. In 1923, Warren G. Harding was President of the United States. He would be dead by September. The economic policies of successor Calvin Coolidge fuels the Roaring Twenties, a time of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity. The good times, however, would come to a screaming halt by the decade's end. In 1923, the Hollywood sign is erected. The Los Angeles Coliseum opens. Time magazine debuts. Walt and Roy Disney start the Disney Brothers cartoon studio that would eventually change the face of family entertainment forever. In New York, Yankee Stadium opens and Babe Ruth becomes an international sports celebrity. And a world away in Munich, a young man fails in his first attempt to seize power in Bavaria. He would bide his time patiently before unleashing havoc throughout Europe. But all of that is far from the minds of young boys around the world like Arthur Littleworth, for now.
The place where I was born was Anderson, California, which is a small town outside of Redding. Both my mother and father were English. They came to the United States after World War I. My father had been in the war. My dad had been raised in a small town just outside of Exeter. in the Devonshire area. He came to California, Northern California, where he worked as a ranch hand. His father operated anyway an inn, a hunting and fishing inn called the Fox and Hounds. And he'd been the master of the hounds. That I'm a first-generation American, and I never saw my grandparents. My mother was raised in Plymouth. She was joining her sister in Canada.
My parents met coming over to Canada on the ship. My mom stayed in Toronto with her sister, and 2 years later, he wrote to her and asked her to marry him, and she came all by herself.
And my mother just worked in the home, and so they were very loving parents, but very humble. My mother was deaf, and so that made a difference. Now she could speak because she learned to speak before she became deaf. If sign language was known, it wasn't in our family. I mean, she lip read reasonably well, but we had to pay a lot of attention to trying to always communicate with her.
12 years old when she had a terrible infection prior to antibiotics, and she read lips beautifully. So you could pretty well communicate with her in that way.
I never thought of it as much of a disability. She could just speak to us. She was a warm individual. I think my father probably has a lot of her qualities.
She was a lovely woman. She never became a U.S. citizen. It's one thing I know. I think she was proud of being English. My grandfather was an American citizen. He was also proud of being English and an American. So he was a quiet man, pretty gentle man.
My dad used to tell me that there were all these stories about how much money people were making in Los Angeles. This was a great place to go. It was booming. They packed up everything they owned in a old Ford Tin Lizzie, and they came down to Los Angeles when I guess I was about maybe 2 to 3 years old. Well, I went to Woodcrest Elementary School. Yes, I was always able to raise my hand and say I had the answers. And I sang in the boys' choir there. I became a Boy Scout at that point to sell magazines for a little pocket money, sold newspapers, used to cut lawns on Saturdays. I'd always been interested in history and English and writing and government and things of that kind.
In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashes, ushering in the Great Depression. Lasting for nearly a decade, it was the longest, deepest, and most widespread economic downturn of the 20th century. At one time, as many as 33% of Americans are unemployed. Additional misery is in store as savage winds start to blow across America's drought-stricken Great Plains. The Dust Bowl causes damage to 100 million acres and the migration of roughly 3.5 million people during the 1930s. Many are headed west to California. And like countless others during this period, the Littleworth family would not be immune to financial hardship as well.
We were, today I guess we would consider to have been quite poor. I never thought of us as being poor. I went to Bret Harte Junior High School. I was the graduation speaker for my graduation class. I then went to George Washington Senior High School in Los Angeles. Had about 3,000 students. Other than my parents, the first person really had an influence on my life was one of my teachers there, and she taught history. And she said, "Arthur, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do in this school." And she went down the list. I was going to be student body president. I was going to be head of the scholarship society. I was going to do all these things. And she intervened in my high school career 2 or 3 times where it made a difference. The other person who became increasingly influential in my life as I was growing up at that time was the rector of our church. His name was Father Stewart, Doug Stewart. He inspired not just me, but a whole generation of young people that maybe wouldn't have gone to college otherwise, but he was always pushing, making sure they were moving on to college. Could discuss anything with him.
Those two individuals really pushed my father and encouraged him in that direction. I know he was a very strong influence in encouraging my father to go to higher education and to go to Yale.
So I think his influence, though, was his openness to different ways of being a Christian. And I think that was very important to both of my parents. Love and great spirit and love of all people. And I think that's what Father Stewart embraced.
When I graduated from high school, I had 3 tickets for graduation. And so I gave, my mother and father had one, and I gave the other one to Father Stewart.
By this time, the family had grown to include 2 sisters, Rosemary, born in 1933, and Gwendolyn, born in 1940. Art graduates from high school in February 1941, number 1 in his class of 355, and is the Yale Pacific Coast Regional Scholarship recipient. Takes 2 advanced algebra courses in the evening that are required by Yale, and is tutored throughout by high school math teacher Francis Lawyer and English teacher John Brandon, as they see to it that Art successfully completes the Yale application process. Throughout his life, Art would never forget his early mentors and the help they had given him, and one day he would start paying it forward. And in late summer, he bids his family farewell and boards a Greyhound bus heading away from Los Angeles to his final destination, Ivy League powerhouse Yale University. Near the end of his first semester, in early December 1941, the unimaginable happens.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
As America enters the war, many universities across the country shift to year-round class schedules and offer men an option. Enlist now and graduate upon return from service, or join the reserves, graduate, and then enlist as a commissioned officer. Yale is no exception, and Art chooses the reserves.
I did join the Marine Reserve. You had to have 20/20 vision, which is perfect eyesight. When I took the Marine Corps physical, I had perfect 20/20 vision. And I guess it was really the following spring. It would have been in spring of 43 it would have been. I wasn't able to pass the eye test. And so they said, well, I couldn't stay in the Marine Corps Reserve. They said, well, we'll give you a medical discharge and send you home. And you can then maybe have some more choices. No, that's not right. And I'm really quite healthy. I just didn't have perfect vision. So anyway, the idea that I was not going to do anything more was just absolutely unacceptable. So I reported to the draft board, and they said, well, you have a medical discharge and you finished for the war. We can't take you into the service unless you waive that medical discharge. So ultimately, I got the waivers through, and then I had to decide which service to go into. And I chose the Navy mostly because it pleased my mother. She said, well, if you're in the Navy, I know that you are always going to have clean sheets. Anyway, I joined the Navy and went to boot camp in San Diego. At the end of that, they assigned me to radio school, a naval training station there it was then called Chavez Ravine, and it's now where Dodger Stadium is. So I graduated from radio school and went back to San Diego for assignment. Went on a troop ship. We were not told where we were going, and the captain told us we were going to
Manus Island in the Admiralties. It turned out that that was where the Philippine invasion was being staged. That was the whole invasion was being assembled right there. It was MacArthur's invasion of Leyte.
By late summer 1944, America has been at war for more than 2.5 years. Deadly battles have been waged across the globe. The loss of life has been catastrophic. As Art and his shipmates set sail for Manus Island, many must wonder what uncertainties lie ahead, given the casualties that the U.S. has already suffered.
I finally got orders to join a ship. The ship was the USS Currituck. It had a crew of about 1,200 people. It was the flagship for the 7th Fleet Naval Air Force. It had an admiral aboard. And I found out on the island of Morotai, ultimately got to Leyte. And Leyte was getting bombed all the time. And one day, I'm told that the Currituck is in harbor. I was on the Currituck through the end of the war and then actually past the end of the war because our ship became part of the fleet that took the surrender.
He talked about a typhoon, and the typhoon was terrible. And it's one of the typhoons that was probably towards the invasion or coming back to the Philippines to retake, and there was a terrible typhoon. And that waking up in the dawn, seeing none of the ships, and learning later how many had been sunk, and simply a fleet of ships would all scattered. And it was one of those memorable events. And he's also on one of these islands I talked about. While he was waiting, an ammunition ship exploded. It was a terrible, terrible loss of life. So he didn't shy away from the terrible stuff. But the war didn't scar him. He had had both, silly adventures and some very serious times as well.
Remember, glorious moment at San Francisco, and all the ships that were coming home would fly all their flags. It was right about New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, right in there, and we were all in dress uniforms, and there were lots of people. I actually totally surprised my mother.
I was 5 when he came home he'd been in the Philippines. We were out playing, and I remember him walking up the sidewalk. My sister saw him first, so he greeted us, and that was wonderful. And then we went into the back door of our house, and my mom was in the kitchen with her back to the door, and I remember he came through the door, threw his duffel bag into the floor, and she felt the vibration. She turned around. Oh, she was so excited. I remember that. And we were all so happy to see him.
Her name was Evelyn Lowe, and she had been a friend of Art and his family for years through services at their church. Especially fond of Art's mom, Rose, Evie, as she was known, was 4 years younger than Art, and he had not paid much attention to her in their youth. The age difference doesn't seem to matter as much. Once Art graduates from Yale and returns home for additional military training. The years, it seemed, had changed the both of them.
When I came back from the service, went to church with my mother, I saw this very pretty young woman who had then grown up a whole lot. And so I asked her if I could call her that week. And so she said yes. Evie was 4 years younger than I. And there was a football weekend at Stanford, and I invited her there. Actually, that's when we became engaged. When I went to Stanford, I sort of looked on graduate school as just my 4th year of undergraduate work, although I got a master's degree out of it. I thought that I might like to be involved in the State Department. There was an article in Time magazine about Yale Law School. The mission really was to groom leaders of the country. So when I had been accepted, I had also become engaged. And Evie had not been out of California. We decided together, really, to go east. And maybe it's a good thing for both of us to start our marriage. We were married 2 weeks or so before we left, and our trip across we had a week at Laguna, and then our trip across the country was sort of a honeymoon. We took a couple of weeks, so that was wonderful. That's how I got to Yale. Those were days when we had practically no money, but wonderfully happy days.
Art and Evie enjoy their time at Yale Law and the New England charm of Connecticut. Art excels in school and graduates in 1950. The couple decide to head back to California to be closer to family. Upon their return to Los Angeles, Art is eventually offered a job at prestigious Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher and is given the weekend to mull his decision. That very same day, Art has a happen chance meeting with a young lawyer at a Yale alumni luncheon, who invites Art to come out to the small community of Riverside, some 50 miles east, and interview at his firm, Best & Krieger. The small but venerable law office is hiring.
My wife and I drove out and we met with Gina Mildred Best and Jim and Lois Krieger and John and Marge Babbage and Jerry and his wife all on that Sunday. And it was clear they were just all extraordinary people. And so we had sort of an agonizing decision.
He walks up Riverside's Mount Rubidoux that day to think about his decision. He and Evie would still be close to family, enjoy the small-town ambiance that they had come to cherish at Yale, and perhaps be able to make a difference.
We finally decided that this looked like a community where we wanted to settle, and I think we've never regretted that decision.
And as he looked out over the city from Mount Rubidoux that day, he could not possibly have imagined how he would soon enough start to impact and help shape the future trajectory of this small community. Arthur L. Littleworth is on his way to Riverside. He joins the firm in the fall of 1950. Managing partner Jim Krieger becomes a mentor to Art and introduces him around town to community and civic leaders. Urged by Jim to be active in a host of service organizations from the outset, in 1955, Art is named Young Man of the Year by the Riverside Junior Chamber of Commerce.
You know, I'd done divorces. I was on the State Bar Committee, Resolutions Committee for Domestic Relations, and I taught a banking course in commercial law out here at UCR. And, you know, you do all the kinds of things that, that sort of a general practitioner would do.
By 1957, Art and Evie have two small children, daughter Anne, born in 1952, and son Todd, who is 3 years younger. In 1957, a verdict is reached in a long simmering lawsuit initiated by and favoring Orange County that serves to severely restrict the water supply of Riverside. Litigation between parties, which commenced in 1951, would eventually last 18 years. The arc of Art's legal career is about to take a dramatic upward turn and also provide him greater clarity.
The issue starts to evolve following World War II. Tremendous growth begins to occur throughout Southern California, both in the lower watershed in Orange County and also up here in the Riverside area. And Orange County interests had been successful in the past in limiting upper districts or upper areas' ability to use water for agriculture, and they had limited their ability to use water for spreading in the groundwater basins. But following the war, they realized that the cities were starting to grow and were consuming native water that the Orange County people believed was theirs. So they bring a suit in the early 1950s against the 4 major cities in the upper watershed. Riverside's one of them. They're successful at the trial court level in establishing limits on the city of Riverside and others. So they win the case at the trial court level. It goes up on appeal. And this is where Art comes into the picture. And he writes the brief, he makes the arguments, and lo and behold, he wins. He wins at the appellate court level on behalf of the 2 mutual water companies that were making water available to the city of Riverside. Art, young lawyer, goes to work for Best and Krieger, and in an effort to put the city of Riverside in a position where they weren't limited to the amount of water they could take. The trial court had decided that Riverside's rights to water were a particular amount, and that amount is probably about half of what the city needs today. So if that position had prevailed, the city would only have about half of the water supply that it needs today. The city could continue to grow. Well, that frustrates the folks in Orange County. So at that point, Orange County once again files another lawsuit. This time they said, we're going to address this upstream issue once and for all by including everyone in the case. So they file against everyone. So the mutuals get filed against every farmer, every owner of a production facility, anybody who was diverting from the stream. There were over 4,000 parties. It's known to be the most complex and large litigation in the state of California. Once again, Art becomes involved in that case. Orange County wants to establish limits on everybody in the upper watershed. Art has a favorite moment, one that he remembers really well. He was in a car riding with some of the other lawyers, and the folks from Orange County begin to suggest that they might consider dropping their interest, their effort to enforce limits against everybody in the upper watershed, and that they might just settle for a guarantee from the upper watershed for a certain amount of water to flow in the river to Orange County through the Prado Dam area. Art was delighted in the turn of events that eventually led to the settlement. It was this change in attitude, this change in approach on the part of the Orange County folks that permitted us to reach the physical solution that we did here in the Santa Ana, and we end up, in that case, all of the prior limitations on water were relaxed. People could produce and divert whatever amounts of water they wanted, so long as the 4 parties that committed to make this delivery to Orange County in exchange for the limits, so long as there was compliance with that. About halfway through the negotiation of the '69 settlement, Orange County people raised the issue of water quality. They suddenly realized Orange County has urbanized and they need municipal water supply. They need good quality water. So they begin to want to put water quality parameters in the settlement. Upper districts simply couldn't agree to that. And so in the end, they reached a pre-settlement agreement that the 4 parties that were responsible for this delivery at Prado would undertake the development of a comprehensive water quality management plan for the watershed immediately following settlement. And they did. Water disputes are often very heated, and It's been very useful for me to watch Art, watch him in meetings, how he handles controversy, how he deals with other people, and how effective. What's important here is how effective his approach to dealing with other people is in solving very complex problems, very heated, very controversial subjects. He has a way of calming the situation. There's just an approach that he has that results in solutions. So the settlement, in the end, once the plan was adopted and implementation began, was comprehensive in the sense that it dealt not only with water rights, but it also dealt with water quality. We've had major improvements in the water quality in the basin. We've had good understanding among the parties with respect to the use of the water, and it's been an extremely successful endeavor on the part of watershed interests in the watershed. Water reliability is a key factor in the economic development of any region. It means jobs to people. It means opportunities for recreation. It means a lot of things to people in the watershed. To not have this ongoing dispute regarding how much water is available. Uncertainty goes away. Industries, businesses thrive because they recognize that we have a reliable supply of water. In this particular case, we've gone 50 years without a major lawsuit involving this watershed.
So by the time I came out of that, people thought I knew something, and one thing then, led to another.
Water, the very source of life. Only 2.5% of the water that exists on Earth is fresh water. In California, nearly 75% of the state's water supply originates in the north, mostly from snowmelt and rain in the rugged Sierra Nevadas, while 80% of the demand is in the south. The science of hydrology, or the movement of water, is therefore critical. Two vast projects in California control this distribution. The Central Valley Project, built by the United States government in the 1930s, captures seasonal floodwaters by damming and directing water flows to the arid but fertile Central Valley agricultural economy, among the most fertile farmlands on Earth. The Central Valley Project runs from Mount Shasta in the north to Bakersfield in the south. And the State Water Project, constructed in the 1960s and 70s, is one of the world's most extensive system of dams, reservoirs, power plants, aqueducts, and pipelines, and supplies drinking water to more than 25 million people. It travels from Lake Oroville in the north to Lake Paris in the south, and is the key to California's economy. End users in California include urban, industrial, agricultural, recreational, and environmental uses.
What people don't think about is that most of our water in Southern California comes from far away. It comes from Northern California. It comes from the Colorado River. Art Littleworth has helped make those projects happen, has helped continue those supplies. Art had his hand in the construction of the State Water Project. The State Water Project brings water from Northern California to Southern California. Without that, Southern California, as we know it, wouldn't exist. So it's really not exaggerating to say that because of Art, that when a drop of water is delivered for consumptive use in Central or Southern California, the vast majority of it has been touched in one way or another by a Best Betchen Krieger attorney, and that's due to Art Littleworth.
By 1965, Art's law practice focuses almost entirely on water law. In the community, he is now president of the Riverside Unified School District Board of Education. But at home, he is simply dad to his two children.
We had very, very few rules. Growing up, we had no curfew. But we knew what those rules were without being told. we knew we had standards.
If we disappointed our parents, as my sister and I, both my mother and father, if we disappointed them was the worst punishment we could get. And they sort of set what we expected to do without ever having to talk about what we shouldn't do. And it was quite remarkable, I think.
When we were doing things, there were always sort of teachable moments. But if we strayed, they would nudge us into the right direction.
You know, at home, Dad was, I guess the thing that we remember the most is he worked. He had a desk in the bedroom, and he worked at that desk, I just think every day of his career.
In 1948, President Harry S. Truman bans segregation in the military, unaware that he also plants the seed of social change. By the early 1960s, stark images and grim details had made their way into the living rooms of the now 90% of Americans with televisions. The American Civil Rights Movement had delivered a sobering yet distressing message: that the decades-long struggle and attempt to end the legalized racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, and segregation in the Deep South, known as Jim Crow laws, had been met by intimidation, harassment, violence, and even death against the black population. Following the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, holding segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional, black leaders opted for a new strategy: direct action. Tactics that relied on mass mobilization and nonviolent public demonstrations. A young minister from Georgia became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the movement. In Los Angeles, the Watts riots during August of 1965 lit a fuse on the West Coast. The civil rights movement and the issue of school segregation were heading to Riverside, and Arthur Littleworth would be ready and play a pivotal role.
In 1958, one of the school board members was retiring in midterm. I had been involved in the school bond issues and was appointed. And then in 1962, I'd been on 4 years at the time, I became president. Riverside was growing very fast. We were building schools very rapidly. The activities in those years didn't really have much to do with racial problems. We had at that time a minority population of about 20%, fairly equally divided. We began to realize that we didn't understand what they were going through.
Well, I think what's important to remember about the era, it was a very long time ago and very different than today. And we shouldn't make the mistake of evaluating what was going on in that era by today's standards.
The education program in the elementary schools before the integration program was certainly not as good in the segregated schools as it was in most of our schools. In all kinds of standardized test results were in the bottom quarter or so of our schools.
The integration story begins in 1963 and for Riverside. And for the first time, I began to realize that there were problems, racial problems in the schools that I was not aware of. And we determined that we needed to do something about this. We developed what came to be called a compensatory education program. They wanted simply to upgrade their local schools. There was funding then available from various federal programs. I think the first indication that I had that things were not going as well as I thought was in the spring of, I think it was maybe late spring, May of 1965.
The minority community perceived that to be the result of sometimes of deliberate discrimination, other times of neglect, but they thought they had poorer teachers, inferior equipment, not as good books. Basically, they weren't getting the same opportunities that other schools were receiving. I don't think that was true. And as a matter of fact, some of our very best teachers were teaching in those schools. But the fact of the matter was that the achievement in those schools was not as good as it was in most schools, and certainly not as good as we wanted it to be.
We had 3 totally segregated schools, elementary schools at that point. We had then probably another 2 or 3 schools where the minority population was very heavy, probably more than half. The middle schools and the high schools all had minority populations in various amounts. The effort then was really concentrated at the elementary level.
So it wasn't as though nothing was being done, but it was being done, again, in a totally different and in an era of really lack of understanding of some of the fundamental problems in the community. And Lowell School was a focus of this. In their huge expansion and growth in the city, that just by simple redistricting caused Lowell to be strictly a minority school.
The Watts riots were in August of '65. And of course we all watched that happening with horror. And one of the slogans that they used there was "Burn, baby, burn." So we all saw that on the headlines and on the TV and so forth.
The Watts riots became a rallying cry for the local minority community, saying, we don't like the structure of our education, among a whole lot of other things in our civil society we don't like. And now all of a sudden there was confrontation and demands.
Tuesday after Labor Day, I got a call that morning from the mayor, and he was quite upset. He had been asked to attend the meeting on the prior Friday evening, but it was with, I think, primarily black parents. Apparently there were some angry words. Just about 9 o'clock, I get there and the city manager comes up to me and tells me that Lowell School has just been burned. And as it turned out, that apparently the fire had started about 2 a.m. in the morning, but there'd been no alarm sent in until 4 o'clock. And as I learned even later that day, the fire marshal told me there's no question it was arson.
And then all of a sudden we wake up in the morning reading the paper that Lowell School had been burned. Apparently it was an arson fire. You had Art Littleworth stepping up as a leader along with the other board members in an extremely volatile situation.
Well, we had a regular school board meeting that same day. There was a spokesman there. He was the spokesman then for a large minority group that was there. And his petition was fundamentally to close Lowell School, which was mostly burned, and Irving School, which was the next nearby black school, and to integrate all of the remaining elementary schools. They wanted, among other things, to know immediately what was going to happen. I said, well, there's no way we can give you that kind of an answer on this petition in a moment like this. So they all stormed out. Well, we learned the next day that they were organizing a boycott. At this time, I was not going to my office anymore. I was at the school office, and I was there for essentially a month.
I saw Art devote himself and gave of himself. He sacrificed his practice to save this city.
The superintendent at that time was an old line superintendent. Bruce Miller knew everybody in town. He was, I think, a very, very good superintendent, but not prepared for this kind of issue. Ray Berry was the assistant superintendent at that time, and Ray and Art Littleworth took over. The minority community trusted him, and they certainly seemed to trust Art Littleworth.
Finally, the two people they would talk with were Ray and myself. So rather quickly, we decided that we would integrate the children that had been displaced throughout the school system, and that we would not rebuild Lowell. This time we now have a boycott going on. They wanted to meet with me alone. A house on the east side out in the backyard. And there were about 20 or 30 black parents there.
He's looked up and saw a little boy in the tree, and it just made him smile inside. There was something that was calming about that when he saw this little boy who smiled at him. It calmed him and gave him a focus of how he was going to conduct this gathering.
We got around to the boycott. I'm trying to tell them to call off the boycott. They said, well, if the boycott was going to be called off, I would have to convince the minority community. So they said, we will get a meeting together at Irving School the next night, Friday night. They invited me and Ray Berry to that, and they didn't want anybody else.
I've never forgotten that. And I had the honor and the privilege of watching a true dedicated human being to the betterment of his community.
The two of us then that night went off to Irving School. It's packed, and our request that they call off the boycott. And on Monday, everybody goes to school except the displaced children. By this time, we had some plan as to where they would meet, where we would take them. I think that was an answer that many of the people accepted, but not all.
Well, I'm here, and these parents are really being ugly, and I don't like to see humans abused. I don't care, doesn't matter gender, race, or anything. I just don't like to see humans abused. And Arthur Littleworth, when he's sitting up there and he's taking major flack. So yes, I came to his, that's how we became friends. I came to his defense because I didn't approve of that. Till today, Arthur and I still remain friends, and he remembers that I was there to try to bring some sanity to it and tell him that he was trying to do the best he could under the circumstances.
The community meetings were a good deal more tense than most people in the community ever realized.
I remember waking up one morning and I looked outside and there was a cross on our lawn. And I quickly went in and told my parents. And it was after that time that we went to another home. There was security.
I think, though, in Riverside, none of us understood how deep the racial problems were. And that lasted for a very long time. So we were all a little blind, right? And it took a long time for people to realize how difficult the situation was, and went way past the integration in Lowell School.
That Monday, the boycott was on. We had virtually no minority students in school. You know, our custodial staff and those people were pretty much not there. We had another school board meeting on Monday. It was again jam-packed. I began to think that we had almost more of a community problem, and I began to feel it was essential that we become one community and one people. We agreed in principle at that meeting, and we asked for 30 days to develop a specific program.
So Art Littleworth sat and calmly listened to this. His great strength, very calmly listened to everybody. And he said, I suggest 30 days. If you will give us 30 days, we will come back to this meeting with you and we will present a plan. In the meantime, we will work with you on that plan. The way he said it deflated this confrontation. He had that ability.
Ray Berry and Bruce Miller and I were talking, and Ray said, you know, I've about come to the conclusion that we should just do it. We should just integrate the schools totally right now. Nobody had done this in the country. The idea was that we would take the the students from the schools, disperse them on a classroom by classroom basis throughout the system, and that we would bus them. The decision was made in '65, although the program didn't start until '66. We were also dealing with the Hispanic community. They had a school right in the middle of Casablanca, which basically they loved. We would take an extra year to work with the Casablanca community, but if, no matter what, at the end of 2 years, it would be integrated. At the end of the 30 days, we had the plan prepared. It was how people saw it.
They came back 30 days later and laid out the integrated busing program, and that was accepted. But Art sitting there was the key to that. What would have happened if somebody else had been sitting there, or they had taken another approach? Of course, no one knows.
I was thinking about two problems, really. How could we bring about the best education for the children under our charge? And how could we try to bring about the kind of America that we all want to have 10 years and 20 years from now? A country where there is true equal opportunity. I don't believe that any of us want and can rightfully ask for more than that. We want to try to create an environment where all of our people can realize that potential and really face each other with as much an equal chance as we can create.
Art had been responsible for leading the Riverside Unified School District in the voluntary integration of its public school system, the first school district with more than 20,000 students to do so in the nation. It was a story of national significance. Today, Riverside has eliminated busing in all but 2 of its 34 elementary attendance areas. School integration in Riverside had, in fact, led to neighborhood integration throughout much of the city. Riverside is proud of this heritage, and with community input, the work continues. In 1966, Art is named Outstanding Elected Official by the Riverside Civic League. The following spring, newly inaugurated California Governor Ronald Reagan telegrams Art asking that they meet soon to discuss school integration. Just 10 days later in Sacramento, Art met with the governor and several other school leaders from throughout the state. The meeting was relaxed and informal, and lasted for several hours. In 1972, famed New York Times columnist Tom Wicker pens a column for the paper detailing Riverside's 1965 integration efforts. The piece is titled, "No Easy Way." He retires from the school board that same year and receives a congratulatory letter from Governor Reagan. The following year, Art is named the City of Riverside's Outstanding Community Leader. In 1970, Governor Reagan considered appointing Art as a University of California regent to fill out another's unexpired term.
He had an opportunity to be appointed to be a UC regent, which to him would have been, fantastic, wonderful thing. Ronald Reagan was the governor at the time. And he came home and he explained to us that he was almost certain that he would be given the appointment, that Ronald Reagan just was hinting that he needed Dad to say that he would be a little more conservative. He just had to be a little more conservative. And all he had to do was say it. And he just wouldn't. And he just had to stay with his position, what he was and what he would offer. And he knew he had not gotten the appointment. That's one of the hardest things that he ever went through, but a great lesson.
For the more than 24 years that they worked together, Art and managing partner Jim Krieger had forged a powerful professional partnership, and their families had maintained a close personal relationship. Jim had become one of the most influential men in Art's adult life. On the afternoon of Thursday, January 9th, 1975, Jim left Riverside and took a commuter flight from Ontario, California to Los Angeles for a connecting flight to Wyoming concerning a major project for a client. Jim Krieger would never return.
Jim died in
1975, in a airplane crash, a commuter airplane crash between here and Los Angeles.
Jim Krieger is the one who started the water practice at Best, Best and Krieger. Apparently there was a feeling around the community that that might be it for Best, Best and Krieger. And Art was the primary attorney who stepped forward and said, that's not it for Best, Best and Krieger. We're going to keep going. And Art is the one who kept the water law practice going. So we wouldn't have a water law practice today, and indeed we might not have a law firm.
And there were people around in the water field that said, well, that's the end of Best, Best and Krieger, because that's just too big a loss. He was too big a man. Arthur just stepped right in there. He was number one right away.
I felt a tremendous weight of responsibility. You know, it was suddenly you feel responsible for all these people. Can we keep this together? Because he had been such a dynamic person. Jim was as charismatic a person as I think I have ever known.
Within days, we knew we would continue as a firm. And we knew that we would continue with a distinguished leader.
It was a tremendous blow to my father.
Jim would know his client's business before he met that client. That's the lesson that Jim had taught my dad, and that's the one my dad talked about to me that he had learned from Jim.
By 1970, Riverside's downtown business district had been in steep decline. The city's fabled Mission Inn Hotel, long the public face and cornerstone of the community's vibrant past, was in decay. Years of mismanagement and neglect had taken its toll. To many, the property would be best served as a parking lot. A small group of community leaders and volunteers, however, disagree and step forward to take charge. Among them is Arthur Littleworth.
Well, of course, the Mission Inn was a vestige of the great hotel era of the late 19th and early 20th century. And Frank Miller, who is, of course, an icon in Riverside history, was a showman, basically. And he built the inn in such a way to have this experience. As they moved in to the era of the automobile and then into the Depression, this Grand Hotel concept pretty much faded away. But the Mission Inn held on.
An amazing building, and really a collection of buildings. And when I moved here in 1950, it was just the center of both economic and cultural life. When Frank Miller died, his family ultimately sold it to the Fairmont Hotel chain in the 1950s, and so they began to strip a lot of the movable things. Ultimately, it went from their hands to somebody else. It was operated by a trustee in bankruptcy.
In the late 60s, early 70s, downtown was at the bottom. The auto dealers had left, the retail had left, and the Mission Inn was in terrible condition. The charge that I had was to set up redevelopment all over Riverside, and especially in the downtown area. There were a lot of voices that said, the Mission Inn has failed, no one can make a go of it, we might as well give up.
Prominent Riversiders still viewed it as kind of the spiritual hub of Riverside. And so they wanted to do something. There were bankruptcies and sale and resale.
There were voices that said it's too important to let it go. It started with the Friends of the Mission Inn, Esther Klotz, Sue Johnson, Beverly Wingate, many others. So the redevelopment agency tried and tried to figure out what to do with the Mission Inn.
Then there was a suggestion that it be turned into an old person's home, that it be torn down and just turned into a parking lot.
It was struggling along with just a few people occupying a couple of those rooms as apartments. That was the situation in 1976. Riverside's downtown was in sad decline.
Art Littleworth and a handful of other people provided a kind of, again, a kind of mentorship, a kind of leadership, a kind of vision, the importance of that into downtown, to identity of the city, to the future of the city.
Naysayers came in and said, let's get rid of it. And Art Littleworth was one of these who felt otherwise.
Finally, we realized that one possible option is acquisition by the City of Riverside Redevelopment Agency. And under the law, we were able to buy properties and then lease them for renovation or use. Two primary people that stepped forward were Tim Hayes. His family owned and operated the Press Enterprise. He was the editor and publisher. And the second was Art Littleworth. By 1976, we had sold our first bond issue of $4 million, and that was to make a big impact on bringing downtown back. Again, with Tim and Art, and primarily Art, here we were asking the City Council to spend $2 million of the $4 million to purchase this failing rundown Mission Inn. We promised the City Council if they would step forward and buy the Mission Inn that we would form an entity, a foundation if you will, to help run it and restore it. I took that to the City Council. The City Council, without discussion, approved the formation of the foundation with the 16 names that we provided. Primarily because we were able to say Art Littleworth has agreed to be the chair. Art was a very effective, very influential, very special person. Art had a special manner. He commanded respect in a gentle way. We all felt good to be in a meeting with him. We felt good that he was the chair. But Art and I sure did enjoy the transfer of the Mission Inn to city ownership.
But we were just so naive about what it would really, take. And it's in bankruptcy, and there were parts that were literally in shambles. Plaster was falling, holes in the wall, debris all over. The sewer system was all broken. We had really never enough money to do anything with, and we gradually began to bring it back to life.
Art Littleworth's management style was very low-key. He had a way of expressing himself and giving an opinion that people listened to. I can't explain it. It was a manner, a style to command that kind of respect. And the rest of us could babble on incessantly, or even say the same thing he said, and not command the respect or the attention that he did.
He was part of the Monday Morning Group, a lobbying group that went back to Washington, D.C. Each year to meet with government officials and representatives. And on one of the trips, he had a long conversation with the Secretary of Commerce, Elliot Richardson. Art befriended him, told him about the Mission Inn. The next thing you know, Elliot Richardson, Secretary of Commerce, is here in Riverside, and Art's touring him through the Mission Inn. Well, the Mission Inn shows well. It was in bad shape, but it shows well. And sure enough, we got a $2 million Economic Development Agency grant, all because Art was such an effective community leader and spokesman for the Mission Inn. He was able to put forth common sense solutions in a comfortable way.
I was president for 2 years. We worked at it for 6, 7 years, something like that. It became apparent by this time that a lot of really expensive work had to be done. And the city council was getting more concerned about putting any more money into it. But finally, the city decided that they should sell it to a private developer. And so they did. I think the improvements that went into it were in the range of $40 million. but didn't realize what the cost was going to be. And ultimately, the bank had to take over. Then they started looking for buyers. Then finally, a fellow named Dwayne Roberts stepped up. I'll buy it. He bought it for cash. The money that he gets from it, he puts back into the inn. You know, he's treated the inn as a jewel, and he recognizes sort of the historic responsibility that one has.
Well, Art Littleworth was one of a small group that had the vision of what the Mission Inn could be. It's the most important architectural, cultural, one of the most important economic entities in Riverside and the region. My experience with Arthur is the mark that he left on the Mission Inn. Art and the community can be very proud of where it is today compared to where we started.
When Art Littleworth spoke, people listened.
In May of 1977, Art is appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to a new 9-member commission to review California water rights law.
I principally became aware of his work as a water lawyer when he was appointed to the Governor's Commission to revise California water law. It was a very high-level commission. It was principally made up of judges. The retired Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court was the leader of the commission. I was able to attend a number of their public meetings, and it became quite obvious to me early on, the one who was making the most important statements that the other members of the commission seemed to coalesce around was Art Littleworth. When he spoke, everyone listened.
Although he could be incredibly serious and was incredibly serious about client issues, he never lost sight of having fun. When I was a first-year associate, again, I'd known Art, just a couple weeks, and he had a client meeting on Halloween, and he took me out to lunch to go over some issues related to that client. But he was wearing his cone head when we went to lunch, so we walked down the street in Riverside with him in his tuxedo and cone head.
Oftentimes it was, who is this person? It was wonderful the effect he had on people, and that showed to me that Art never took himself that seriously. He allowed himself to be an object of humor and laughter.
He would have been an actor. He's had a great voice. He had great talents. The biggest memory, though, is his Santa Claus. He played Santa Claus at the firm parties, which were so important, very family-oriented. And he was a great Santa, and he'd be Santa for our house and our family and our kids. And he was great at it, and he loved that.
Remember this fellow in a clown outfit handing out candy on roller skates, rolling up in front of the Art Alliance building, and someone says, that's Art Littleworth. He's a lawyer with Best and Krieger.
You'd never know this guy in a clown outfit with huge pockets and a red nose was the leader of the leading law firm in the area.
It became such an epic Halloween thing. It was like Universal Studios at the firm. Of course, he handed out the tasks, and he recruited some new associates for the Blue Man Group, and they were like traumatized over it.
Everything stopped for Halloween. Everybody participated, and they'd have costume contests and parades and musical performances, and he just loved it. He loves children, and he played with them. As his children grew up, they participated as well. To this day, he loves dressing up.
In October 1982, Evie is admitted to the hospital for a severe reaction to a medical treatment that was administered to her. The night before her scheduled release, Art has dinner with his wife at the hospital and heads home. Later that evening, Tuesday, October 26, 1982, Evie Littleworth dies suddenly of a heart attack. She was 55 years old.
Well, I remember a phone call from my father saying that she had passed away, and it was so traumatic, and he was so sad.
I learned she had died at 11 o'clock that night. One of her great fears is that she was losing her hearing. And the fact that her great strength was music, that was terrifying to her.
She was being treated to try to prevent her from going deaf, which we knew would be terrible for her. Really, really would have been terrible. Her illness was something that we thought was, workable.
She was young, and it was unexpected. My brother picked me up at the airport, and the two of us just embraced my father and just sobbed and just held one another.
I've never seen him so affected. It was difficult. I tried to talk with him, but he was bereft without Evie.
She went into the hospital and she didn't come out. It was a great shock. That evening he was over at our house and we talked about the future, and I remember him saying, "I don't know what I'm going to do." But that was something he handled himself, and he handled it very well.
We got the call, shockingly, that she had just passed away. He adapted, so well. It was hard. I loved her very much.
She would encourage us to be independent. She was such a vibrant personality. I was newly married. We were starting a family, and I probably wasn't as aware some of the deep grief that my father had. It was very sad. It was very sad, but certainly by the time we would be gathered, we'd have lots of laughter and joy.
She was a people person. She loved ordinary people. She really pushed back against any kind of social climbing or snobbery. We knew it was a terrible loss for us. Today we know it's a terrible loss for our children not to have met her. But I think also it wasn't so terrible for her.
My father was, and still is, a terrific grandfather. My children spent so much time with him as very young children. He was a single man. My mother had died before I had children. And so he spent quite a bit of time with us, and we would come visit him quite a bit. He's a very, very affectionate, loving person, always has been.
When his first grandchild was born, Brooke, he was able to spend so much time with Brooke and then later with Cameron, and he was, wonderful, and it was an experience for both the grandchildren and for him. During that period of time, he needed to have, that warmth and that family and stuff, and so he was a lovely, wonderful grandfather, and my children today, love and admire him so much.
Now alone after 35 years of marriage, Art is sustained by his faith, family, and friends, and decides to throw himself headlong into work to keep busy. And by the end of the decade will be universally recognized as one of the most preeminent water law attorneys that the United States has ever produced. Meanwhile, in Northern California, East Bay Municipal Utility District of Oakland, known locally as East Bay Mud, was defending itself in a lawsuit that had been mired in pretrial legal wrangling for nearly a dozen years. Finally convinced of the need for outside legal expertise, they reach out to Arthur Littleworth.
EDF versus East Bay Mud was a lawsuit that was filed in 1972. It was an effort by a number of environmentalists, primarily, to prevent East Bay Mud from being able to take advantage of the supplemental water supply contract it had negotiated with the federal government. That was a contract to reach out to a point of diversion on the American River and then eventually try and pipe that water essentially 75 miles west to the East Bay area. This case involved a challenge between an organization, East Bay Mud, that was seeking additional high-quality drinking water to serve its 1.25 million customers. And they were challenged in their attempt to do so by a series of organizations, a county, 2 state entities, state agencies, and a series of environmental groups that did not want East Bay Mud to take any water out of that river so that as much water as possible could be kept in that river for recreational and environmental uses, and in particular, as the case evolved, to protect fisheries interests in that stretch of the lower American River.
Our view had been that there was enough water in the river to allow East Bay Mud to make diversions under its contract and still to provide adequate flows for fishery purposes and for recreation. And we suggested, actually, to the state board, we suggested that they decide the case in a conditional way, that we would be allowed to divert only when there were certain minimum flows in the river. And the state board adopted those numbers.
East Bay Mud supplies drinking water to what was then about 1.25 million people in Oakland, Berkeley, San Leandro, and the other cities along the East Bay shoreline, but also the cities of central Contra Costa County, the booming cities of Walnut Creek and Lafayette and Moraga and those areas.
The fundamental supply of East Bay Mud at that time and still today comes from the McKelney River, a dam located upstream Sierra foothills called Pardee Dam. But it was clear that the Bay Area was going to need more water. The best supply that they thought they could acquire was from the United States, from the Bureau of Reclamation. That was the contract that was made in 1970 to take water from, it's really out of Folsom Dam.
The case began in 1972, but until 1984, it was a case that was kind of tried on paper. In other words, there were lots of legal arguments. There were 2 important decisions of the California Supreme Court about the case. There was a decision of the United States Supreme Court about the case, but that whole time we were just dealing with legal issues, and suddenly, in early 1984, we had to deal with the facts that were at issue. Facts about water quality, that was East Bay Mud's objective. Facts about fisheries and recreation, the people who were trying to stop East Bay Mud, that was their issue.
We went into court saying, we think there's enough water. We're not trying to take the position that we don't have to be concerned about environmental flows. And these are the flows that we think are adequate. And we had 2 themes. One is there is enough water to supply East Bay mud and all the downstream river uses. Second theme is that more water is not always or necessarily better for fish, which was a revolutionary idea.
My little office didn't have the manpower to be able to handle that case. We needed outside help. I wanted to get lawyers who were the utmost in professionalism. And the best I knew of in the state at that time was Art Littleworth. Great ability as a lawyer, but the most important thing he brought to us was an air of professionalism, I'd have to say dignity. He had a statesman-like quality in the way in which he did his work as an attorney. And I'm absolutely convinced that his mere presence raised the level of performance of everyone on our team. Everyone wanted to be sure they did their level best to measure up to the standard that he set. And that's just an incomparable standard in my experience.
And one of the ultimate suggestions in the case by the plaintiffs was that East Bay mud should take water out of the delta. But water quality was a key issue. East Bay mud looked at all the sources and found that the water quality and the upstream on the American was excellent. And then the other big issue was the health effects or impacts of either taking water upstream where the quality was good or taking it farther downstream where the quality was not as good.
In the end, after really 3 separate rounds of trials on the facts, we ended up with a decision by an Alameda County Superior Court judge that I believe allowed both sides to say they were winners. East Bay Mud's ability to utilize their contract to get a supplemental water supply was protected, preserved, and eventually it was utilized. And the county and the environmental and state organizations' efforts to protect water as it was necessary for the habitat for fisheries in the Lower American, they also won, and we found a physical solution. When East Bay Mud succeeded in that litigation, it protected its contractual ability to utilize that high-quality source, and it in fact can now do so whenever it chooses to. At the same time, the fisheries are protected. Both sides won.
And Judge Hodge ruled a physical solution which is set standards for the in-stream uses as minimum flows, and then we will divert only when those flows can be met. The flow requirements were sufficient that it would allow both sides to get what they wanted.
The average drinking water consumer in East Bay, when they turn on the tap, when they make their cup of morning coffee or tea, can rest assured there are very, very few higher quality water supplies anywhere in the nation. And Art's work in the American River case ensured the protection of that very high quality water into the future. And for those people in the East Bay who like to drive up to Sacramento and fish in the Lower American River or have their recreational activities there, because of Art Littleworth's work, those people can know that their fisheries or their recreational experiences up there can also be of a very high quality level, because the work that Art Littleworth did helped protect those interests also. I've only known 3 lawyers in my professional career who I would consider to be capable of having that impact on a case. And of those 3, Art was clearly the best.
Understanding the law extremely well knowing what the client's objectives were and knowing how their problem needed to be solved, and then figuring out a way to cast that in a reasonable light. And on top of all that, an incredibly gracious man, always very classy, treated the opponents very graciously as human beings. All those things are what made Art preeminent.
Brilliance, fairness, dignity, and respect at all times. It is preparation. Preeminence also demands, quite certainly demands, humility.
I told him that so-and-so had said he's the finest lawyer he'd ever met. He said to me, "Don't you get tired of that sometimes, people saying that to you?" Meaning as a lawyer. And that was important for me. I think about it now. It was a moment of that sense of, his value, of his sense of worth for me as well.
In 1987, while doing some work around the house on a Saturday morning, Art's phone rings. It is Byron White, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, calling to ask Art if he would consider helping the High Court by serving as its special master on a water law case between two states. It is an honor that had been accorded only a handful of water law attorneys since the United States Supreme Court's inception in 1789. Arthur L. Littleworth is about set to reach the absolute pinnacle of a legal career.
During the time that Art Littleworth was representing East Bay Mud, he was approached by an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Byron White, who told Mr. Littleworth that the court was interested in appointing him to serve as a special master in a dispute between two states. And Art, being the professional that he is, and knowing that he had a duty of 100% loyalty to his clients, responded to Justice White and said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't believe it would be appropriate for me to take on the role of special master. At the same time, I'm discharging my duties to my existing clients." So he said no. What a hard thing to do.
Not much more than 8 weeks later, the phone rings again, this time at the office.
My office was next to Arthur's, and I heard his secretary, one row down, saying, "No, I'm sorry, he's not here." Who is this? Justice White, she said. It turned out to be Whizzer White, John Kennedy's appointment to the United States Supreme Court. He called back that day, and I think with great glee, was able to be appointed special master in the case of Kansas versus Colorado. And it was a wonderful opportunity for him, and very good opportunity for the United States Supreme Court to get a good water lawyer doing work that frankly none of them would have been able to do without help in one way or another.
Justice White called again, and I remember getting a phone call from Art, and I remember vividly when he said to me, "Bob, I can't tell him no twice." That is a clear demonstration that you have reached the absolute top rung of the water law ladder when the United States Supreme Court says to you, "We want you to do this." And they asked Art twice.
The interesting thing to me is that there are only one class of cases that go to the United States Supreme Court under its original jurisdiction. And those are cases where one state actually files a lawsuit against another state.
Often it has been how to share water, and that's what we had there. It was a suit between Kansas and Colorado over the Arkansas River. Now, that dispute had started back around 1900.
I became involved in the Arkansas River in about 1975. And at that time, Kansas and Colorado were generally getting along quite well.
In the late 70s, this piece began to fall apart. Less and less water was coming down. Kansas didn't know whether it was weather or whether there was something else going on.
There's about 150 miles of Arkansas River between Pueblo and the state line, so that's the stretch of river that we're dealing with. And there's about 60 miles of the Arkansas River in Kansas between the state line and Garden City. By the time you get to Garden City, they have pretty much used up the river, except for flood flows. The key to the case then was whether whatever happened in Colorado would materially deplete the usable quantity of water flowing into Kansas.
Well, enter Kansas. They filed suit in the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices have a lot of important things to do, so they hire a special master. And who did that for them? Arthur Littleworth. He is the man. He is the person that they identified who could best help them to actually get into the case, look at the details.
To be a special master is one of the highest honors that any lawyer can have in a legal career.
The average amount in 1950 to 85, the average amount of water which was passing the state line into Kansas was 145,000 acre-feet a year. And in the 1970s, it was down in the order of 72,000.
I mean, this whole thing that I'm describing, it was a titanic dispute between two sovereign states. It led the states to lock horns over groundwater pumping that was sucking water out of the river and interfering with the groundwater that was otherwise discharging to the river and should have been coming down to Kansas.
In the 1950s, 60s, you could put in a well without any permission. Nobody knew you'd done it. You could pump all the water you wanted to without telling anybody, and that's what happened. There were, as we started the trial in 1990, about 2,000 wells in Colorado.
The use of water was becoming more efficient, which should, over the long haul, produce more water for Kansas. Kansas was not satisfied with that response, alleging 3 separate damaging activities in Colorado. And the 3 activities were the way in which the Trinidad Reservoir was operated on the Purgatory River, the way in which the Pueblo Reservoir was operated on the main stem, and the failure to curtail the use of large capacity irrigation wells on the river.
So Arthur Littleworth was appointed in 1987 to take on this important job. He did such a good job that sometimes the court would just say, we're going to quote the special master on this issue because he did such a nice job of saying why this position is correct. And that is, to me, when you can provide the language that the court actually wants to adopt verbatim in its opinion, it's not something that I can remember ever seeing in another Supreme Court decision that was reviewing a special master's work. I represented the state of Kansas, and so we had a long period of discovery, and then we went into trial. Trial in this case lasted 275 trial days. Most full-time litigation trial lawyers don't have 275 days of trial in their career. Over a period of 13 years, and with trips up to the 9 justices and back several times, this case lasted from 1990 to 2003 in terms of actually being in trial. And in fact, this case was the first United States Supreme Court case in which a model was used to determine the final outcome of the case. And it was Mr. Littleworth who decided that that should happen.
large-scale computer models were used to replicate the ground and surface water system. The two states that were engaged in this were using Sun microsystem processors. There were not groundwater flow models that had been developed at any level of sophistication.
There is no question that this was a most difficult system to model. You have 150 miles of stream. You basically have to account, in order to make that model work as well as possible, you've got to account for every drop of water that comes into the system, how it's used and goes out of the system.
And to be able to explain to the U.S. Supreme Court how it worked, why it was reliable, why the results of the model that he selected actually were reasonably accurate in predicting and representing what had gone on in the Arkansas Valley and what could go on into the future.
As the computer modeling ultimately was to show, Kansas was not getting its proper share of the water even in the early years, starting in 1950.
This had never been done before. He therefore adopted a more modern, more physically based approach, and the court supported him on that. In fact, the court supported him on just about everything. He did things that the Supreme Court justices either couldn't do or were not in a position to do. Questions of engineering and science, and he would understand that at a level that just wasn't possible or practical for a Supreme Court justice to do. It's amazing even now to think about how good a judicial demeanor Arthur Littleworth had in the courtroom. He was also very good at encouraging agreement.
He, I think, encouraged my opponent, Mr. John Draper, and me to treat one another collegially. In part, the result of that, Mr. Draper, who was the attorney for the state of Kansas, and I have over the years become friends. He is the most amazing gentleman, a calm but commanding presence. The states of Kansas and Colorado have now proceeded, since the final decision was rendered in the late 1990s, to work together for the intervening 20 years without any conflict at all.
You could count on a couple of hands probably the number of people that have been special masters in water cases in front of the United States Supreme Court. For a water lawyer, you couldn't get a higher honor, to be honest.
It is a case about very, very complicated water law issues. Most lawyers never practice in water law. Most judges have never had a water law case in practice. And so when this case came before the court, who did they call? Well, they called the most knowledgeable lawyer with the greatest reputation for integrity and, of course, hard work. And that was Arthur Littleworth.
If you want to know about Art Littleworth's philanthropic endeavors, don't ask Art Littleworth, confided a friend. In 1987, Art quietly establishes the Arthur L. Littleworth Endowed Scholarship. Each year, the Riverside Unified School District selects one worthy high school senior who plans on attending the University of California at Riverside. UCR Littleworth scholars in good standing will receive scholarship monies for each of their undergraduate years. As a scholarship recipient himself, Art understood what it meant to both need and receive help. And he had never forgotten the men and women who had mentored and inspired him in his youth. Arthur Littleworth would now start paying it forward.
I've become much more confident in what I'm doing. This scholarship truly has changed my life. I think it's changed me as a person, truthfully. I don't think I would push myself as hard without them as the role models they've been for me in my life.
I can't say enough how generous Mr. Littleworth was for being able to give me the opportunity to pursue what I wanted to do. I didn't have to worry about the stress of having to work several jobs as well as the student loans and having to pay those back right after college. I try to talk to a lot of students and tell them that whatever you want to do in life, if you find something you're passionate about, find a career in it. I like to be confident in everything I do, always do everything 100%. And I think the confidence part is that there's certain things that hold us back, and you have to be able to go over that wall and be able to venture out and do new things.
For me, this scholarship was a support system, and I got 2 awesome role models from it. So all 4 years, it was me telling Peggy and Arthur about things I was doing, things I wanted to do, and I was always met with incredible support and excitement about what I was doing, and it just always made me want to push more and do more.
If you're able to do it, help someone else do it as well. If there's any way that I can make an impact or say thank you, it's trying to recreate that in my own self of trying to help as many people as I can. Sometimes they need a mentor like Mr. Littleworth had that inspires them to be able to realize that their dreams are possible. It's just you need that push, and if you're able to do that, I think that's huge. So
follow your dreams, not anybody else's but your own. And I think I've finally hit that point where I'm doing what I want to do.
Not long after being named a special master, Art notices a lump in one of his breasts. Medical tests reveal a malignant tumor. Art has a mastectomy, treatment, and is back at work in no time. Art Littleworth continues to march forward. In the early 1990s, Art is reacquainted with Peggy Shaw, whom he had known through mutual friends for a number of years. This time, however, life has something else in mind.
I first met Arthur when I was part of a catering group called A Movable Feast. We started out as a group of people on the board of the local Riverside hospice, and we got together and offered dinners for the fundraisers. That we would do a gourmet dinner for people, and they would bid a lot of money to have this dinner provided for them. And Arthur was one of our greatest supporters. We would cater for Arthur after our hospice stints also. And that's how I met him. So our very first date was a Rams football game. And to this day, I think it was a bit of a test. He was an avid Rams football fan. He is to this day. He had season tickets from 1950 until the day they left for St. Louis. So I think the deal was sealed when he took me Christmas shopping.
And when he started talking about her, his eyes lit up. I just knew that this was like, oh my goodness, he's finally found somebody, He was excited, and I could tell that it was a life changer for him.
In 1992, while on a trip to Yosemite with friends, Art and the group come to a decision. They would plan trips around the world together to celebrate their friendship and curiosities. They would call themselves the Walk Group, and their trips together would be among the most meaningful times of their lives.
The Walk Group is one of the happiest groups and times of my life. Over, I think it was 12 years, and 9 countries we walked, from 12 to 14 miles a day.
And as we're walking along, Arthur Littleworth always was leading the pack. He may have been the oldest, but you would never have known it. He was so fit and enthusiastic, and he'd be walking along ahead of all of us.
So about every 2 years, we would take walks all over the world, be together for a week. We'd fly in and meet and walk together for a week. The things we saw and learned were wonderful.
We had the most wonderful time, and Art chronicled it all with his masterful photography.
He is an incredibly talented photographer, and so the only time he would stop on the walk was to take a wonderful photograph, and he was so generous in sharing them with us afterwards.
And here's this wonderful group that came together in friendship, and to this day is united in elevated friendship.
And the laughter that we had during those trips those were some of the best times of my life.
To this day, we get together once a year. We give a dinner at our home, and it's the Walk Group dinner just before Christmas. I make people come in black tie and formal clothing, and then I have them wear silly hats and I have a theme every year, and it's a different theme, and we have a lot of fun with it. And just being together with friends and sharing experiences is what life is all about.
In 1995, Art and Best and Krieger colleague Eric Garner, author, California Water, a comprehensive yet concise guide to historical, legal, and policy issues affecting water use in California. It would quickly become one of the most useful reference books ever written on California water, a seminal work and industry standard.
The success of California Water came as a surprise to both Art and myself. To be honest, the idea came because nothing had been written about California water since the 1960s at that point, which is everything was 20 years old and a lot had changed. I was the one who came up with the idea to write a book about California water. Art was a little skeptical of that, but he let me run with that, and then he obviously took the manuscript and with all of his experience on that first edition, made it a phenomenal book, and neither Art nor I expected people to care so much, and nor did we expect them to then want a second edition or then want a third edition. And I don't think Art ever imagined when he said, yeah, let's go ahead and write this book, that 25 years later, the interest in water would be so much greater in California and that the demand would only increase for that book. So, the lasting legacy of Art Littleworth in water is that when you wake up in the morning and you turn on the tap, you don't have to think about where the water comes from.
In 2000, by way of a city proclamation, Art has named Riverside's Citizen of the Century. In 2004, he receives the Frank Miller Civic Achievement Award. The following year, the Riverside Unified School District dedicates its recently refurbished performing arts theater, the Arthur Littleworth Theater, for his efforts during integration. In 2007, Art adds the prestigious Erwin Chemerinsky Defender of the Constitution Award. In December 2006, following a memorial service for a friend, a stranger approached Art, thanked him, and mentioned that he was a Riverside police officer in 1965, assigned to investigate the Lowell School fire, and that he was grateful for Art's leadership. The man left before Art could get his name. The encounter convinced Art that once retired, he would write his recollection of the school integration. Retirement came sooner than expected. In January 2008, Art enters the hospital for surgery. His life, as he knew it, would never be the same.
He had to have abdominal surgery. After the surgery, he had a stroke.
Well, that was terrible. He's 85 years old. And then trying to come through rehab, which is a terrible experience for people because the system is not good. So he came home and Peggy took over.
He was in ICU for 21 days and then at Loma Linda for therapy for 3 weeks. And then he came home and then he just decided he was going to prevail.
He had a very serious stroke. Here's a man who's lost his speech. He continued to improve. He certainly at times can be somewhat fluent.
I could see so much progress every time that I saw him. And he's just a fighter. And and he went through this with such grace.
He worked so hard at physical therapy and speech therapy for years. That's a terrible shock to realize what's happened to you, especially with a man who is so eloquent to not be able to speak well, and who loves the outdoors and loves hiking, to not be able to hike and do the things that he likes to do.
He was robbed of so much of what he was in terms of his ability to be so physically active.
It's just amazing what he has accomplished. He continued to push ahead, a tremendous will to live. I think throughout his life, there's a positive attitude.
He never, ever gave up. He never gave up. I never heard him complain. I never heard him lament what happened.
Never have I heard him be angry or despairing. He may have felt all those emotions, but he didn't show it.
You know, we had to learn to do all sorts of things over again. You know, it's one of the things to just be a really bright person, a hard worker, a person used to hard work, and being able to persevere and overcome this. And he's overcome it beautifully.
He's a couple times said, "Oh, I wish I could just run."
What a gift she's been to him. And she's been a loving partner and a tremendous caregiver to him. How lucky he is to have had two wonderful marriages and two very different women.
You know, Peggy's really made Dad very happy. We didn't have big dinner parties or other things, and we realized that Peggy does that, and so it was a part of his life that was missing. And then Peggy has a house in an orange grove, and so he was able to finally live in an orange grove, which had to be one of the highlights of his life. I think being a little bit of an orange baron is a wonderful thing for him.
She has never stopped helping us to laugh. She's never stopped helping art in laughter. She's never stopped supporting art. She is a hero to me.
And we all love her as much as we love Art Littleworth now. She is just the best thing that ever happened to him, I think.
What Arthur is to water law, I would say Peggy is to entertaining. And she makes everyone who's invited realize what a pleasure and an honor it is to be invited into her home.
She's just a wonderful lady, and she amazes me with everything she does and helping him and doing all the other things that she does.
Art's rehabilitation also allows him time to revisit his love of painting, given up more than 50 years ago due to his hectic work schedule and family responsibilities. His talents seem limitless.
I've watched him from day one to be such a good painter. And I'm always, every time I see it, it's very inspiring to me to see how good he's turned out and how he's learned, all by himself mostly. And I knew that he could be an artist if he wanted to. He just was good at everything.
He's just prolific. He paints all the time. He doesn't have a particular style. The only thing is he loves bright colors, and so he uses a lot of strong color. It was some kind of a natural ability that he has, and he loves it. It really is good for him.
With wife Peggy steadfastly at his side, Art approaches rehabilitation with the same steely determination and singular focus that has always marked him as a man. He also sets out to write his recollection of school integration. Although mindful that his right side has been compromised by the stroke, he knows he still has two aces in the hole: the support of Peggy and the fact that he is left-handed. In 2014, his personal reflection is published as a book, No Easy Way. Art Littleworth is 91 years old.
Well, the miracle is, after the stroke, he wrote a book and had it published. That's an accomplishment. It's hard enough for someone with all their facilities working to do, so he's quite extraordinary.
In November 2014, he is honored at a book signing gala and celebration at the very Poly High School theater that bears his name. This time, the theater is rededicated to him and now includes a timeline mural with highlights of Art's life intertwined with that of America's history. It is a fitting tribute to a man who by now is a community treasure. Arthur L. Littleworth's legend and legacy is epitomized by his understated and self-effacing manner, his humility borne out through his statesmanlike grace and elegance.
But Art had something special over and above the many, many attorneys I came across in my 50 years of practice. It was a gentleness on his part. And his reputation preceded him, so people knew that they were in the presence of brilliance.
There's something special about him, something unique, and I think every now and then we all see somebody, whether it's on a TV screen or give an amazing speech, and think, wow, there's really something special about that person. Art Littleworth is one of those people. You just sit with him for a while and you realize there's something really special about this man.
During my time, both as a council member and as mayor, the most difficult decisions that were before the city, I would call Art up and say, Art, can I come to your office and talk?
He expects from every person that he's dealing with that they will be civil, that they will be courtly, that they will be honorable, because that is the way in which he conducts himself at all times.
There's something about him that makes you want to be the best person you can be.
He's just a good example of what every water lawyer would like to be.
I never heard him say a bad thing about anyone.
I think that when you look at good leaders, and he was a good leader, you realize that his talents were patience and listening, and then being decisive.
How do we best define a good life? Perhaps there are as many different definitions as the number of people we ask, but one thing seems quite certain. We're able to identify it in someone, that special something that makes us follow them, simply by the way they lead their own lives. When asked what attributes one must possess, Art offered this:
loving his family and friends, being optimistic, emphasizing the good, appreciating the blessings of life, having a sense of humor, and being satisfied with what he does, a job that we love, coupled with the ability to give.
He had become his community's consummate citizen, and citizens like Arthur L. Littleworth will always be by our sides. And for as long as mountain snows melt to form the streams and rivers that journey down to the communities which they sustain, the gentle breezes shall whisper their names.